A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Asher. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. The Garden of Eden has been interpreted in many different ways throughout history. Some have proposed that the garden's geography is only symbolic, and there are a wide range of views referring to it as things such as a never-never land, a literary utopia, etc., implying that the Garden of Eden was not a real place. However, this is not the way Scripture treats the topic. Instead, the garden is viewed as a real place where humanity's parents once lived. This essay will attempt to answer the question, where was the Garden of Eden located? The most common place to locate the Garden of Eden is in modern-day Iraq, the home of ancient Mesopotamia. The main reason for placing the garden in Mesopotamia is the mention of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Genesis 2, which run right through the country. There has been debate on the location of the Pishon and Gihon rivers, the other 2 rivers mentioned in the garden account. The Pishon has been identified with the Ganges River in India, the Danube River in Europe, the Wadi Batan in Arabia, and even the Phasis River in the region of ancient Armenia in the Black Sea. The latter would place the garden not in Mesopotamia, but around the area of Armenia. To help support these locations, the Wadi Batan in Arabia is located near a place that in Arabic literally means cradle of gold. The Phasis River in ancient Armenia is located near the land of Colchis. Both places are believed to have been the land of Havilah, mentioned in Genesis chapter 2 as being a land where gold is found. The Gihon River has been identified with the Nile River, primarily because Genesis chapter 2 verse 13 says that the Gihon winds through the land of Cush. This Cush is often believed to be the same as the land of Cush that existed south of Egypt. There have been other rivers that have been identified as the Gihon, including the Araxes River in the region of Armenia. Some scholars have located the Gihon closer to Iraq. They equate the land of Cush in Genesis 2 not as the Cush in Africa, but possibly the land of Kusu, just east of Mesopotamia, where a group of people known as the Kassites lived. It is argued that the Gihon could be one of 2 rivers in the region, the Karun or the Kureka rivers, both of which wind through the land of Kusu. There are major difficulties with each of these locations. For example, placing the Pishon River in northern Arabia has problems. Although it sounds like an airtight argument equating the Wadi Batan with the Pishon along with a land that means cradle of gold, the Wadi does not fit the description that Genesis 2 gives to the Pishon. The Wadi Batan is a particularly straight stream of water and does not wind about at any point. In fact, there are no rivers in this area of Arabia that fit the biblical description of the Pishon. However, there is a much bigger problem than this. Genesis chapter 2 verse 10 specifically says that, quote, a river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters, unquote. None of the rivers proposed to be the Pishon or Gihon rivers fit this description. In fact, neither do the Tigris or Euphrates rivers. There is simply no place on earth where we can find one great river splitting into 4 smaller rivers. This leads us to a few different conclusions. First, one could simply shrug their shoulders and ignore this problem and still locate the Garden of Eden in the Middle East. Second, one could conclude that the author of Genesis got the details wrong about the Garden of Eden. Or third, one could argue that the geography of Earth's surface has changed. Which one you choose depends on your view of Scripture. If you believe that the Bible is an accurate historical record, then you are not going to believe that the geographical details of the garden are inaccurate. If you have a low view of the Bible, then it is not difficult to believe that the author got some details wrong. Some people try a middle ground by having a high view of Scripture, but arguing that the intent of Genesis is not to present a real Garden of Eden. Instead, they would argue that the garden is only an allegory. Instead of concluding that Genesis 2 is wrong or an allegory, there is another possibility, and that is that Genesis 2 presents us with a much different past. This means that the geography of the region or of the entire world has changed drastically since that time. If this is true, the question then becomes, how could Earth's geography change so much? The only real possibility is the destructive force of the Great Flood. Studies have shown that if the flood occurred as Scripture teaches, then the surface of the world would have been completely rearranged. Just think about how devastating local floods can be. Combine that with tsunamis, earthquakes, and other natural disasters, and it is not hard to understand that a real global flood, as described in Genesis, would wreak havoc on Earth's geography. This would make it impossible for us to know the location of the Garden of Eden. This means that the rivers of Eden and the other geographical details in the second chapter of Genesis would no longer exist in our world today. This idea is not new, as Martin Luther, John Calvin, and even St. Augustine recognized the possibility that world geography has changed. Writer Andrew Kolakowski summarizes the issue well when he says, "It should be clear from the above discussion that the description of the geography of Eden and the garden corresponds to no place on earth at this time or in recent history. The only way inerrancy could be saved is if the Earth's geography had dramatically changed after the account of Eden had been constructed. The most obvious explanation of how such a change could have occurred is by means of the global catastrophic flood described in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. A skeptic of the flood view may ask why the geographical names in Genesis 2 fit so well with modern geography. We have the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, we have Cush, we have the Havilah, whichever Cush or land of gold they may be. Scholar John Munday says, quote, "Genesis portrays a landscape little changed by the flood, particularly that the Tigris and Euphrates are still in existence today." I do not believe that this argument is as strong as many think. Similar geographical names are easily explained by linguistic borrowing. Ken Ham says it perfectly. Quote, "This being the case, the question then is, why are there rivers named Tigris and Euphrates in the Middle East today? In my native country of Australia, one will recognize many names that are also used in England, for example, Newcastle. The reason is that when the settlers came out from England to Australia, they used names they were familiar with in England to name new places or towns in Australia. Another example is the names given to many rivers in the United States. There is the Thames River in Connecticut, the Severn River in Maryland, and the Trent River in North Carolina, all named for prominent rivers in the UK. In a similar way, when Noah and his family came out of the ark after it landed in the area we today call the Middle East, the region of the mountains of Ararat, it would not have been surprising for them to use names they were familiar with from the pre-flood world, for example, Tigris and Euphrates, to name places and rivers, etc., in the world after the flood. In response to this, Munday argues that there is no evidence in Scripture for renaming or naming a place after an earlier one, that is, more than one place with the same name. This, however, is incorrect. There are many different examples of place names being used for more than one location. These include Cush, Asher, Kadesh, Goshen, and Zanoah, just to name a few. Interestingly, Munday even agrees that the Cush of Genesis chapter 2 is not the same Cush as the rest of the Bible, where it always refers to Sudan or Ethiopia, as he places it around the Iraq-Iran border. Why does he allow this here, but not with the other names? Another argument used against the flood view is the mention in Genesis 2 that God planted the garden in the east. A common view is that the phrase "in the East" is from the perspective of someone in Israel or Egypt. Thus, Mesopotamia is likely in view here. This makes sense because Moses was writing to an audience living after the Great Flood. This is the view accepted by those who place the garden in Mesopotamia. However, another interpretation is consistent with the flood view, and that is the phrase "in the East" refers to the eastern portion of the country of Eden. This makes sense because a literal translation of the Hebrew would be, quote, "in Eden, on the side of the east," unquote. A third view interprets the phrase "in the East" as referring to the east of Adam's point of view. For example, Henry Moore says, quote, "The garden was planted eastward, Adam's location at that time being somewhere west of Eden, in the land of Eden," unquote. The major point here is that the phrase "in the East" can fit a Mesopotamian or flood perspective of the Garden of Eden. Some concluding thoughts on this topic. Locating the Garden of Eden relies upon whether a person has a high or low view of Scripture. If one does not believe that the Bible presents us with an accurate picture of the world, then it is easy to interpret the garden as only a myth or an allegory of some sort. If a person believes that it gives us an accurate view of the world, then one will see things differently. A major part of this is believing whether or not the Great Flood was a real, universal, destructive flood. If the flood happened, then it is easy to see that the garden cannot be located using modern geography. If, however, one rejects a universal destructive flood, then one must try to locate the garden using modern maps or throw up their hands and say it is only a story. As I detailed earlier, there is no place on earth currently that matches up with the geographical details in Genesis chapter 2. What we do with this fact tells us a lot about how we think of Scripture.